chosen one. Something strange is happening around you right now. The people who once had easy access to you are starting to feel your absence in a way they cannot explain. You didn't argue, you didn't chase, you didn't fight for attention, you simply changed. And that alone was enough to shift everything. Now they look back and realize how casually they treated your presence, how freely they shared your space with others, and how little they understood your value at the time. What they thought would always be available is no longer within reach. And the shocking part is, you didn't lose anything. You didn't fall behind. You didn't become less. You simply became harder to reach, because Allah elevated you to a place where not everyone is meant to follow. There was a time when you didn't truly understand your own value, so you believed that always being available made you kind, and letting people into every part of your life made you loyal. But in reality, you were giving people access to something they had not earned: your time, your energy, your thoughts, and even your deepest struggles. And many of them didn't have the maturity or sincerity to handle that responsibility, so they took it lightly, shared your space with the wrong people, and treated your presence as something ordinary when it was never ordinary at all. And that's where the shift happened, because through those experiences, Allah made you realize something powerful: that access to you was never a right people were entitled to. It was always a privilege that should have been protected. And now you move differently. You think before you open up. You observe before you trust. You protect your peace instead of trying to please everyone. And the same people who once had unlimited access to you are now feeling the distance. They're realizing the silence. They're recognizing the absence. And deep down, they know they lost something rare. Not because you became arrogant, but because you finally understood your worth and stopped giving what was sacred to those who treated it like it was nothing. There was a time when you believed everyone deserved a place in your circle, so you didn't question who people brought around you or who they allowed into your space. You trusted easily, you welcomed openly, and you assumed that if someone was close to you, they must also carry good intentions. But life showed you a different reality. Not everyone deserves closeness. Not everyone is meant to sit at your table, and not everyone who smiles with you truly respects you. Because some people entered your circle without understanding your value, and others were allowed in by people who didn't protect your boundaries. And that exposure slowly disturbed your peace, drained your energy, and made you feel uncomfortable in your own space. But that experience wasn't wasted. It was a lesson, a deep awakening that taught you the importance of discernment. And now you no longer let everyone come close. You observe more. You choose carefully. You protect your circle with intention, because you finally understand that your environment shapes your peace, and those who once opened your space to the wrong people are now realizing their mistake, because not only did they lose the right to bring others near you, they also lost their own place in your circle, and that's a loss they can't easily recover from. There was a time when you felt the need to explain everything, to respond to every message, to keep people updated about your life so they wouldn't misunderstand you, and you thought that constant communication was the way to maintain connection. But over time, you started to notice something deeper. The more you spoke, the more people misunderstood. The more you explained, the more your words were used, twisted, or taken lightly, and the more access you gave through your voice, the more your peace was disturbed. And that's when Allah guided you toward a different kind of strength, the strength of silence. Not a silence of weakness, but a silence of protection, where you no longer feel the need to prove yourself, defend yourself, or share every detail of your life, because you've realized that not everyone deserves to hear your thoughts. Not everyone deserves updates about your journey, and not every question requires an answer. So now you move quietly. You keep your plans to yourself. You grow in private, and you let your results speak instead of your words. And this silence has created a distance that people can feel but cannot understand, because they were used to having full access to your world. They were used to knowing what you were doing, how you were feeling, and where you were going. But now they are left guessing, watching from afar, trying to figure you out without any clear answers. And that uncertainty makes them uncomfortable, because they no longer have the control or the insight they once had. And deep down they realize that your silence is not random, it's intentional. It's a boundary they cannot break, a space they can no longer enter, and a reminder that the version of you who once spoke freely is gone, replaced by someone who has learned that not everything needs to be said, not everything needs to be shared, and that true power often comes from what you choose to keep within. There was a time when you thought people leaving your life meant you were being abandoned, that doors closing meant you were losing something important, and that distance was a form of rejection. But as your understanding grew, you began to see a deeper truth, that sometimes Allah removes you from certain people and environments not to hurt you, but to protect you and elevate you, because not every place you feel comfortable in is meant for your growth, and not every connection is meant to stay in your life forever. And this is not something new. Even in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, there were moments when separation was part of elevation, when he faced rejection in Makkah, when people he grew up with turned against him, mocked him, and pushed him out. It seemed like loss on the surface, but in reality, it was preparation for something greater, because that painful phase led to the Hijrah to Medina, where he was honored, supported, and given the environment needed to establish a strong and guided community. And in the same way, Prophet Yusuf, peace be upon him, was removed from his home, thrown into a well by his own brothers, sold into slavery, and later imprisoned unjustly, and every stage felt like a loss, like isolation, like being taken away from where he belonged. But each removal was actually positioning him for a higher purpose, until eventually he was elevated to a position of authority and honor. And when you reflect on this, you begin to understand that what feels like rejection in your life may actually be redirection, that Allah sees what you cannot see. He knows who is not good for you. He knows which environments are holding you back. And sometimes He allows certain situations to happen, even people exposing you to the wrong crowd, just so the truth becomes clear to you, so that you can no longer stay in places that were slowly damaging your peace and limiting your potential. And once the lesson is complete, He removes you completely, not as a punishment, but as a form of mercy, a form of protection, and a step toward elevation. And now, when you look back, you realize that being distanced from certain people was actually a blessing, because it pushed you into a different mindset, a higher level of awareness, and a closer connection to your purpose. And the same people who once had easy access to you are now confused because they don't understand how you changed so much. They don't understand why they can't reach you like before. But what they don't realize is that you didn't just walk away. Allah moved you, Allah elevated you, and once He lifts you to a different level, not everyone is meant to come with you, and not everyone is allowed to reach you again. What hurts them the most is not just your absence, it's the realization that you are no longer the same person they once had easy access to, because the version of you they remember was always available, always understanding, always willing to tolerate things just to keep the connection alive. And they grew comfortable with that version of you. They relied on it. They assumed it would always be there no matter how they behaved. But what they failed to notice was how much you were silently evolving, how every disappointment was teaching you, how every moment of being taken for granted was shaping you, how every time your value was overlooked, something inside you was shifting, becoming stronger, clearer, more aware, until one day, that quiet growth turned into a visible change, and suddenly you were no longer responding the same way, no longer entertaining the same conversations, no longer allowing the same behaviors, and that shift created a distance they couldn't ignore, because now, when they try to reach you, they feel a different energy, a different mindset, a different presence, and it confuses them, because they're still expecting the old version of you, the one who would always make space for them no matter what. But that version no longer exists, and this is where the regret begins to grow deeply inside them, because they start to replay everything in their mind, every moment they took you lightly, every time they didn't respect your boundaries, every time they allowed others into your space without thinking about how it would affect you. And now they understand something they didn't understand before, that your presence was never ordinary. It was something rare, something calming, something real, in a world where most connections are shallow and temporary. And losing that creates a kind of emptiness that is hard to replace, because they don't just miss talking to you, they miss how you made them feel. They miss the peace, the sincerity, the depth that came with being around you, but at the same time, they are forced to face a difficult truth, that the reason they lost that version of you is because they didn't value it when they had it. And this is where your transformation becomes undeniable, because you didn't change out of anger or ego, you changed out of awareness. You changed because you finally understood that constantly sacrificing your peace to keep others comfortable was not strength, it was self-neglect. And that real growth sometimes requires distance, sometimes requires silence, sometimes requires walking away from people who no longer align with who you are becoming. And as you stepped into this new version of yourself, you began to prioritize your peace over their expectations, your self-respect over their approval, and your purpose over temporary connections. And that is something they can feel even without you saying a word, because your absence now carries more weight than your presence once did, and it forces them to confront the reality that they didn't just lose access to you physically, they lost access to a version of you that they will never experience again. And that realization is heavy, because deep down, they know that no matter how much they try to reconnect, no matter how much they wish things could go back to how they were, it can't, because you have outgrown that space completely. You have moved into a level of understanding and self-respect that no longer allows you to shrink yourself just to fit into someone else's comfort. And this is where your journey becomes powerful, because instead of chasing people to understand your worth, you became someone who understands it deeply within. Instead of trying to hold on to connections that were slowly draining you, you released them and chose yourself. And that choice changed everything, because now your presence is no longer something that is easily available. It is something that is felt only by those who truly deserve it, and for everyone else, all that remains is the memory of who you used to be, and the quiet realization that they had something real, something rare, something meaningful, and they lost it not because you were difficult, not because you changed for no reason, but because they didn't recognize your value when it mattered the most. And now that you have stepped into a higher version of yourself, that access is gone, and what they feel is not just missing you, it's living with the understanding that they had a chance to keep something special in their life, and they let it slip away. There was a time when people around you were used to easy access. They could reach you whenever they wanted, speak to you however they liked, come and go in your life without thinking about the impact it had on your peace. And you used to allow it because you believed connection meant availability. But life has a way of teaching you through experience, and slowly you began to notice that not everyone who had access to you respected that access. Some people only came when they needed something, some only stayed when it benefited them, and some brought chaos into your peace without even realizing it. And this repeated pattern slowly built boundaries inside you, not visible at first, but deep within your awareness. until one day you woke up and realized that access to you cannot remain open for everyone, because every time you allowed the wrong people too close, it cost you your peace, your focus, your energy, and even your emotional stability. And that realization became a turning point in your life, because you started to understand that boundaries are not walls of arrogance. They are filters of protection. They are a way Allah teaches you to preserve what is valuable within you. And as you began to apply those boundaries, you noticed something interesting. The same people who once had unlimited access started to feel distance, confusion, and discomfort. Because they were no longer able to approach you the same way, they could no longer interrupt your peace, they could no longer enter your world without intention or respect. And this change wasn't just external, it was internal, because you stopped feeling guilty for protecting yourself, you stopped explaining your limits, and you stopped lowering your standards just to keep people comfortable. And this is where your transformation became clear, because you realized that not everyone deserves unrestricted access to your time, your thoughts, or your emotions. And even in the lives of the prophets, peace be upon them, we see this wisdom reflected. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught that every person has rights, but he also emphasized moderation, respect, and protection of one's character, and his life shows us that he did not give his trust blindly, but rather he built relationships based on sincerity. And even when people opposed him, he maintained dignity and distance from those who harmed the message. And similarly, Prophet Musa, peace be upon him, also distanced himself from the corrupt environment of Pharaoh's palace when it no longer aligned with truth, showing that sometimes stepping away is not weakness, but obedience to a higher calling. And when you reflect on these examples, you begin to understand that your own boundaries are not random. They are part of your growth, part of your protection, and part of your elevation. Because Allah does not allow a sincere believer to remain open to harm forever. Instead, He gradually teaches them through experiences, through pain, through realization, until they finally learn to protect themselves without guilt. And now, as you stand in this new awareness, you see how your boundaries have completely changed your life. You no longer over-explain yourself. You no longer entertain people who drain you. You no longer feel pressured to respond immediately or be available constantly, because you understand that your time is limited, your energy is sacred, and your peace is irreplaceable. And this shift has naturally filtered your relationships. Some people stayed because they respect your boundaries, and others disappeared because they only valued you when access was easy. And that alone reveals everything you need to know about who truly belongs in your life, and who was only there for convenience. And even though it may feel lonely at times, it is a different kind of loneliness, one that is peaceful, one that is aligned, one that is better than being surrounded by people who constantly take from you without giving anything meaningful in return. And this is why your boundaries are not a loss, they are a blessing, because they are shaping your life into something more intentional, more peaceful, and more connected to your purpose. And those who once had unlimited access to you now stand outside trying to understand what changed, not realizing that the change was not just in your behavior, but in your awareness, your self-respect, and your decision to no longer allow your peace to be the price of keeping people comfortable. There comes a moment in your journey when you stop looking at people who left, people who changed, people who misused their access to you, and you start realizing something deeper and more powerful, that none of it was random, none of it was wasted, and none of it was outside the control and wisdom of Allah. Because every person who entered your life, every person who stayed for a while, and every person who left when they did, was part of a greater plan to shape you into who you are becoming today. And this is where your understanding shifts from emotional pain to spiritual awareness, because you begin to see that even the loss of access you once gave so freely was actually part of your protection, part of your elevation, and part of your preparation for a higher stage of life. And when you look back honestly, you realize that some people were never meant to stay, some were only meant to teach you, some were meant to expose your blind trust, and some were meant to show you what you should never allow again. And through all of that, Allah was not abandoning you. He was refining you, slowly removing what was harmful, what was distracting, and what was not aligned with your growth, until you reached a point where you no longer feel the need to question every loss, because you understand that sometimes what leaves your life is just as important as what enters it. And this understanding is deeply connected to the lives of the prophets, peace be upon them, because when you study their journeys, you see a pattern of separation before elevation, isolation before success, and hardship before clarity. For example, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, faced rejection, isolation, and even hostility from his own people in Makkah, people he once lived among, people who knew him as honest and trustworthy. Yet when he brought the truth, many of them turned away, and that separation was painful, but it was not meaningless, because it led him to Medina, where he was welcomed, supported, and able to build a strong, faith-based community, showing that sometimes Allah removes you from a place not because you are not valued, but because that place is not ready for your growth. And similarly, Prophet Yusuf, peace be upon him, experienced multiple forms of separation, from being taken away from his family, thrown into a well, sold into slavery, and later imprisoned unjustly. And each stage looked like loss. Each stage looked like rejection. Each stage looked like his life was falling apart. But in reality, each stage was a step toward his eventual elevation as a person of authority and influence in Egypt. And this teaches you something very important, that what feels like people being given access to your life and then misusing it is not the end of your story. It is part of your refinement. Because Allah sometimes allows people to see you, experience you, and even misuse that access, just so you learn where your boundaries should be, so you learn the value of your energy, and so you learn that not everyone deserves proximity. And once that lesson is complete, He naturally begins to close those doors for you, not in a way that punishes you, but in a way that protects you from repeating the same cycles. And when you start to see life from this perspective, you no longer carry bitterness about those who left or those who misused your presence. Instead, you carry awareness, because you understand that if they had truly been meant for your next level, they would have grown with you instead of being removed from your path. And this is why your current state of distance is not emptiness, it is clarity. It is a form of protection that prevents you from going back into spaces where your value was once overlooked. And now you begin to notice something powerful, that the more you protect your access, the more peaceful your life becomes, because not everyone is speaking into your mind anymore, not everyone is influencing your emotions anymore, and not everyone is draining your energy anymore. And in that space of quiet, you begin to grow in ways that are not visible to others, but deeply felt within you. Your thinking becomes clearer, your decisions become stronger, your faith becomes deeper, and your sense of self becomes unshakable. And those who once had free access to you now stand at a distance, trying to understand what changed, not realizing that the change was not just about them losing access, but about you gaining awareness, gaining discipline, and gaining a level of self-respect that no longer allows you to return to what once disturbed your peace. And this is where the final realization settles in, that losing access to you was not their loss alone, it was your liberation. Because every boundary you built, every silence you embraced, And every step you took away from unnecessary connections was actually a step closer to the person Allah intended you to become, someone who no longer lives for approval, no longer bends for attention, and no longer opens their life to everyone who knocks, but instead walks with intention, lives with purpose, and protects their peace as something sacred. And in the end, this is what true elevation looks like, not having everyone around you, but having the right alignment with your Creator and the right distance from everything that pulls you away from that alignment. Conclusion. So, understand this deeply. What they call losing access to you was never your downfall, it was your awakening. You didn't become distant by accident, and you didn't change without reason. Allah guided you through experiences, through pain, through realization, until you finally understood that not everyone deserves closeness to your heart, your energy, or your life. The same people who once took your presence for granted are now facing the reality of your absence, and that reality is teaching them what they failed to appreciate before. But for you, this is not about revenge, regret, or proving anything to anyone. It is about growth. It is about protection. It is about finally choosing peace over pleasing people who never valued you correctly. And now you walk differently, think differently, and live differently, because you know your worth is not defined by who stays close, but by how well you protect what Allah has placed within you. So, let them realize, let them reflect, let them remember, because your journey was never about staying accessible to everyone. It was about becoming someone who is aligned, guarded, and elevated, someone who understands that when Allah closes doors, it is always because something better, something purer, and something more destined is ahead.